Part two of the video. We're going to start out some interesting terms here: scallywags and carpetbaggers, used as insults or derogatory terms. In a way, white Republicans coming to the South or living in the South are called scallywags. Essentially, what they meant was traitors. The South was full of native Southerners who were Democrats. If you were a Republican, that was seen as that you supported radical Reconstructionism and you supported equal rights for African Americans, and that was not popular in the South in the Reconstruction period. Not popular for a very long time, as a matter of fact. So you were called a scallywag if you were a white Republican living in the South. Most of the black population in the South at this time were Republicans. You weren't going to vote for a party that didn't believe that you had equal rights as whites. So most were in fact Republicans, but very few whites were Republicans. So the ones that were called scallywags. Now there were other people that were coming to the South now during this time called carpetbaggers. Now these are Northerners who moved to the South very quickly after the Civil War. So quickly, as a matter of fact, they didn't have enough time to pack their suitcases, so they just rolled everything up in a carpet and brought it down with them. This was a negative term, carpetbaggers, because it meant that these Northerners were coming down to take advantage of the economic situation in the South. A lot of them brought industry to the South and took advantage of the people that needed work. Many people were poor, had their farms destroyed. They started their own farms, or they bought old farms and plantations and took advantage of the poor South and the economic uncertainty during the Reconstruction time. Now, most people that came south during this time weren't there for that reason. In fact, most of the people that did come to the South were soldiers occupying the South, or part of groups like the Freedmen's Bureau who came to educate and to help out with the difficult time that people were having in the South after their states were destroyed during the war. But that was kind of a blanket term that the Southerners used for anyone from the North, even though it really only applied to a few of the people that came down. It was a term meant to villainize the Northerners who were living in the South at the time. Now, despite the troubles that were going on during Reconstruction, there was some positives, and that was that for the first time there are African Americans in Congress. The first group of African American congressmen, there's a drawing of them down here, but they included two senators, Hiram Revels and Blanque Bruce, and they were true American success stories. Bruce was a former slave who had risen up to be the first elected senator, African American senator in the country's history. So for this Reconstruction period, there were now seeing African Americans getting representation in Congress. You go back way to the Revolution, that idea of no taxation without representation. Well, now for the first time in our country's history, there is representation for different groups of people. Still not everyone. Certainly, again, there are no women in Congress. There haven't, to this point, been other races other than white or black, but it is the first steps in that direction. Now, as African Americans gain their freedom and gain their rights for the first time, people are still pro-slavery. You don't just say, okay, slaves are free, and then everyone's like, okay, we accept that. During this time, you have a radical terrorist organization born, and that is the Ku Klux Klan, whose goal is to inspire terror and to suppress the free black population and basically try to live out their own goals of white Southern dominance again. Now, the Klan is not the Klan technically that we would think of today. It's early. There's been many iterations of the Ku Klux Klan, but this was a group that actually did commit violent acts against African Americans, against these scallywag Republicans or anyone that opposed their way of thinking. So the Klan would reach its height in the 1920s with over a couple million members. Today it's much smaller, less than 5,000 people belong to the Klan, but it is a organization that's been around since the end of the Civil War, um, and they have committed many atrocities in the past, and certainly have a ideology which is kind of contradictory to what we think of as equality for all and the rights promised to all in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. But um, they it's just a group that is a stain on our country's history, and I don't really have anything more to say about them right now. The period of Reconstruction would continue. There was, again, a lot of problems in the South, mainly dealing with the fact that, one, the South's economy was destroyed, and there was an agrarian economy that was destroyed by the Northern Army that ripped up and destroyed their farms, and also, two, that many people in the South were very, very poor. That includes, of course, the free slaves who literally had nothing. They were never given anything their entire lives. They were forced to work for an owner and didn't earn any money, have any real possessions beyond a handful of personal items, maybe that they maybe were allowed to have. But they didn't have any land. They didn't have any way to work and have a livelihood. Um, and again, it's not often talked about, but most of the South was very, very poor. It was the 1%, the plantation owners that benefited from the slave economy. The rest of the South did not benefit from it because a slave economy is not a very good economy. So the South was poor before the Civil War. And after the Civil War, it was made much worse. But they had to now try to modernize and industrialize the South to allow it to try to catch up to the North and give the people there, both the freed slaves and the poor whites, a decent way of life. But this was hard to do. There were many different ideas on how you could do this. Some people wanted to break up the plantations and give land out to the free slaves as compensation, but there was never any broad consensus agreement on it in Congress. So to survive, a lot of former slaves and some poor whites, former soldiers even in the Confederate Army, turned to something called sharecropping. And what a sharecropper is, it's basically a peasant. If you think back to what you learned in seventh grade, feudalism in medieval times, someone who rents land on a former plantation, a big estate, and then gets to keep some of their harvest and then gets to give some of it to the landlord, like giving it to the lord if you were a peasant. Not too different from slavery for many of these slaves. Still not treated well. A lot of them took up took up work in rented land on the former plantations that they worked on as slaves, so they didn't even move very far. But this was, for many people in the South, really the only option if they wanted to eat, if they wanted to live and have a life in the post-war South. It was not a ideal situation, but many people were forced into it. Now, Reconstruction will end officially in 1877 without too much success, if I'm being honest. A lot of the goals that Lincoln had were never realized. The big successes were the fact that the amendments guaranteed the rights for former slaves to right to vote and the right to be a citizen. But the wounds weren't healed. All right, there's obviously still, especially if you're paying attention to what's going on in the country today, still dealing with the issues of racism that resulted as a result of our history with slavery. And Reconstruction is not really helpful in that regard. It does, however, reinstitute the southern states and allow them to come back into the Union. But again, leave it up to you to decide whether there are more issues created or solved by the Reconstruction period. Now it ends officially with the Compromise of 1877, which was the election of 1860 or 76. After Grant served his 2 terms, the Republicans go up against the Democrats, and dead tie in the Electoral College, 50-50 if you look down at the chart here. They agreed to let the Republicans retain the office, but the Republicans then have to agree to remove the soldiers from the South. and end Reconstruction. They agreed to this. It's a kind of another corrupt bargain if you think back in American history, because once the Southern or the Union Army leaves the South, um, Southern whites take control of the state governments again, and they pass laws restricting the rights of the free blacks. And some of these are like Jim Crow laws that are passed to make it that so that blacks cannot participate in government or vote. Poll taxes that they can't afford to pay are instituted. Grandfather clauses, literacy tests, things that they would have had struggles with, were instituted. And this basically legalized segregation for the next century in American history. It was now things like segregated schools, segregated public transportation and buses and things like that would be legal for the next 100 years because of these Jim Crow laws passed. And that is another dark stain on our country's history that you'll be learning about a lot next year in ninth grade. But if you have questions about any of this whole period of Reconstruction, please come to office hours today. It's a lot to take in one lesson, but we're just going to focus on the main terms. So make sure you go back and do the vocab terms, the bolded terms. There's the sheet and the document on that in the today's folder, so you can submit that when you are finished. If you don't get to it today, submit it tomorrow. All right, guys, last one. You did it. Hopefully the next couple days a little more interesting for you. Again, if you have any questions, come see me in office hours today.